Thank you so much. And I appreciate all of you. There's many of you on this call, on this webinar today, which is an indication of both the urgency of the conversation, but also the awareness that's sort of emerged recently in the press around the use of meth. I want to say just off the start, as I just put up the next slide, which is a summary of the learning objectives, that I've been doing work around methamphetamine for some 20 years now. While there may have been lulls in the last 20 years in our awareness of this particular drug, the drug has continued to manifest itself in various parts of the population. And as of recent, however, has gotten attention again because of some unexpected deaths that have occurred as a result of methamphetamine use in relation to opioid addiction. And I will be talking about lots of those ideas today. So really what I want to do is sort of take you through a journey of, one, describing a little bit about the history of the drug and where it came from and what it does, then talk about how it affects populations, then really dive into the physical, mental, and social health of methamphetamine users, recognizing that addictions transgress the whole human body, mind, and soul. And I think that when we think about addictions, it is insufficient for us to just think about a biological perspective in terms of treating people. And then finally, I'm going to leave you with some thoughts about treatment options for methamphetamine use, recognizing that this is perhaps one of the most difficult addictions to treat because of the psychological aspects of the drug and what it does to a person's emotional life. So I'll go through that today in our time. We'll have a chance at the end for questions and answers and comments and thoughts, and hopefully this will inspire you to act, to continue to consider how to work with your populations with regard to this drug use, and sort of to, come forth and demand that legislators actually pay attention to this drug. I will say that I'm very happy to report that the New Jersey Department of Health, is working with us right now to begin a series of small pilot studies throughout the state of New Jersey to understand the manifestation of the drug again. So at least we're ahead of the curve in trying to get to this issue. So let's talk a little bit about the drug, methamphetamine. I'm also going to use the word crystal meth, and I'll explain how I use these words interchangeably in a minute. So first of all, amphetamines as a class of drugs were first introduced into the world in the 1800s and the 19th century, founded in Europe. Methamphetamine, which is a version of amphetamine, was first discovered in Japan in 1919. The drug, developed by pharmaceutical entities, was used to treat a variety of different disease states, including narcolepsy, depression, obesity, alcoholism, and ADHD. It was prescribed, as you will see shortly, rather widely. And in 1971, recognizing that the drug was potentially dangerous to the populations, it was classified as a Schedule II drug. And while it had acknowledged medical uses, it also was a drug that was recognized to have high levels of abuse. And as a result, as the drug became more difficult to access, black market illegal manufactured versions of the drug became available. So here are just some ads from the last century that appear in the United States that show the selling of basically methamphetamine products, the various versions of the drug labeled under different names, used to treat things like obesity. Like if you look on the upper right corner to keep the reducer happy. It was used as, it was prescribed to all sorts of people, and a lot to individuals who at that time known as housewives, that I'm not going to call housewives now, but women who stayed at home, who were needed energy and were experiencing depression, and this was a way of actually getting them to feel better through the use of this stimulant. So crystal meth is the version of the drug that is the street version of the drug that became popular and became accessible as meth use became more and more difficult to access. So in the late 1950s and early 1960s, as it became more difficult to access the drug, as is the case with any addiction, once you introduce a drug into a population, there are people who are addicted to it. You can't just pull it off and make it difficult. You have to provide resources for individuals who are addicted to the drug to be able to come off the drug. And in the absence of that, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a market. It's a supply and demand scenario. And so illegal versions of methamphetamine that I'm referring to as crystal meth started to become manufactured throughout the United States, primarily in the west coast of the United States and in Hawaii, using all of those materials that are shown in the picture in front of you, which, as if you look at them right now, are hugely problematic if you think about ingesting those into your body. But crystal meth, essentially, as a result of this manufacturing process, resulted in the formation of a drug that was crystalline in nature. It looked like rock candy or salt with various colors. And the drug was used in a variety of different ways, from being swallowed to inhaled to smoked to injected to inserted rectally, known as a booty bump. And it was very easy to produce at home with recipes that were available all over the internet. Here are some images of some labs. You may have seen some of these in Breaking Bad and in other media representations. A makeshift lab here showing how the drug is put together with all of these chemicals in a badly put together chem lab. A super lab here where lots more is being produced. In this map of the United States right here, what you see is in calendar year 2014, the total number of labs that were seized throughout the United States. Now, if I had shown you this map from 2004, you would have seen one stark difference. And the stark difference would have been that most of the labs would have been on the west coast of the United States, with very few labs on the east coast of the United States. And in fact, the drug has moved from west to east over the course of the last 20 years. There are lots of hypotheses about what that is, why that is. Our own research has shown that the demand for the drug has increased on the East Coast because people were traveling to the West Coast were introduced to it, and therefore the demand happened there. That's one hypothesis. But another hypothesis also was that the drug became much more efficient to make. And so while you may have needed wide open spaces in the past, in California and places like that, to make the drug, on the East Coast of the United States, it also became more efficient to make the drug. That's hypothesis number two. Hypothesis number three is that there's some evidence right now that pure illegal manufactured methamphetamine is making its way into the United States through the Mexican-American border. Maybe not so much now as it was 2 years ago, who knows? Maybe yes as much, I don't know. But that remains to be seen, since a lot of that data remains very confused at this point in our political history. But you'll see that perhaps that in California and on the West Coast, the drug is making its way up from Baja and other places, whereas in the East Coast, it's not as easily accessible from Mexico and what have you. Here's another map here, again, of the United States, looking at the 1,000 most recent meth seizures. This is from a few years ago. And again, while certainly evidence of labs on the West Coast, a lot more on the East Coast. Okay. So amphetamine and methamphetamine. So amphetamine is the general class. It's a central nervous system stimulant used to treat a lot of conditions. So is methamphetamine. So if you think about the general class of stimulants, methamphetamine is a subgroup under the category of amphetamines. And then crystal methamphetamine is the illegally produced version of that drug. So crystal methamphetamine is also known by a lot of other different names, including meth, crystal, Tina, tea, ice, glass, speed, some really horrible names like redneck cocaine, which was used to describe the drug, in the past, because it was used primarily by people in rural areas who are often farmers and who had rednecks. That's where the word redneck comes from. But these are just some of the names that's used on the street. And for those of you who do work with the LGBTQ population, particularly with gay men, you'll note that one of the ways that meth users speak to other meth users, and when they're looking for sexual partners or others online, is by using the capital letter T in questions like, "Are you partying?" So at platforms like Scruff and Grindr, which are platforms that some gay men use to meet sexual partners, conversations between gay men often evolve around drug use for some men, and the way that this is communicated, if somebody is a meth user, is by using the capital letter T somewhere in the correspondence as a sort of clandestine way, although it's not really clandestine anymore, of communicating that. Methamphetamine, I've been asked many times as I've been doing this talk over the last 20 years, versions of this talk over the last 20 years, how is it different from cocaine? And the differences are listed in front of you right there. Meth is a man-made drug. In some ways, the first truly American addiction, the first truly American drug that became an addiction, whereas cocaine is derived from a plant. Methamphetamine, the half-life is 18 to 24 hours as compared to a half hour for cocaine. So for those of you who are familiar with cocaine users, you know that they have to keep using coke because the coke becomes metabolized very quickly. The difference between meth and coke is that meth does not become metabolized as quickly. Somebody could be high for an extended period of time using the same amount of drug. 50% of the drug is removed from the body meth is removed from the body within 12 hours as compared to 1 hour in cocaine. So from a purely economic perspective, for somebody who is seeking a high, methamphetamine is a much more efficient, cost-efficient drug to use. And of course, methamphetamine is U.S. made, but also imported, whereas cocaine tends to be imported. Let me go back to that and just say, if harm reduction is the approach that you're using for addiction, and I'm not purporting that anybody should use meth or cocaine, but if you were going to do meth or cocaine, cocaine is the less harmful of the two simply because of the naturally produced nature of the drug. So how is methamphetamine used? It is used, as I said before, in a variety of different ways. Often people begin by inhaling it, but then it can be smoked, and I will show you some images of that. Ingested, which is swallowed, injected, or placed in the anus for a booty bump. And I've used this term booty bump more than once. It is a behavior that has been documented for meth users who engage in meth use for sex. It allows for penetration in a much more efficient way. Smoking and injection of meth produces the fastest rate of absorption. And so as a result, it is not uncommon to see somebody starting as a snorter and eventually, if they become chronic users and become highly addicted to drugs, becoming a smoker and eventually becoming an injection drug user. One of the concerns that is being discussed right now is that while injection drug use has been a modality of use for methamphetamine in non-gay populations, it looks like, although there's still evidence, we still need to gather evidence around this, that injection drug use, which is normally not a very prevalent behavior in gay populations, is also on the rise. So as you might imagine, when you have viral pathogens and other pathogens in the bloodstream, which may be untreated, the exchange of syringes and other works for the use of methamphetamine is not particularly helpful in terms of the transmission of viruses like HIV. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about patterns of methamphetamine use in the United States. I just have this one image here right now that shows that meth use in Wisconsin increased by close to 500% over the course of the last decade. But in 2018, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health showed that use of methamphetamine among people ages 12 and older had increased. So while there was a slight dip between 2015 and 16, the last couple of years have seen an increase of those reporting methamphetamine use. Now, I will say that I often think that these surveys underestimate what is really going on. There are social desirability aspects to surveys. People don't really feel comfortable answering surveys about drug use and sexual behavior. So just take this with a grain of salt and say that it's probably around 1% of the population. Now, the next set of slides I've altered slightly from the version that might have been sent to you because I think it is a responsibility of a statistician to make sure that the bars on bar graphs actually depict what they really are. So you will see here little bars, and they're on purpose because it would be very easy for me to exaggerate and say, oh, look at these huge bars of use. But in fact, when we look at use across age groups, we see about 3% use in 18 to 25. We see about 8% use in ages 35 to 49. So consistently less, on or around less than 10% of the population across age groups. And I depict them as this because if we look at the very first orange chart, for the 2.6% of 12 to 17-year-olds who are using methamphetamine, there are about 93% of 12 to 17-year-olds who are not using methamphetamine. So I think it's really, really important that we present data in this meaningful way. rather than having these really large bars that would exaggerate the impact of the drug in the population. So that's some patterns that you see around age. When we look at differences around race, ethnicity, and culture, what we tend to see here is that there's lots of use. There's high levels of use, about 13% report in the Native American population, where there are also high levels of alcoholism, and then after that in the white population, about 7% of use. There's relatively low reporting of use in the Black population, although that is also on the rise. And our most recent work in meth use in the gay population has demonstrated a shift of the drug from white gay populations to Black gay populations. So 1.1% may be an underreporting of what's really going on there. In terms of educational attainment, about 7% of those with high school or less, 7% of those with some college or degree report meth use, again, around 10% of the population. And then when we look at biological gender, this is not gender identity, but biological gender, about 70% of the users are male, about 4% of the users are female, as per this 2018 survey. And then here is something that's extremely telling, and why we need to attend to this particular drug addiction in the gay population. About 6% of those who identify as straight or heterosexual reported ever using the drug, where the number increases to 12% when we look at gay or lesbian people and 13% for bisexual people. So sexual minority individuals have a higher preponderance or higher rates of use of methamphetamine than heterosexual people. And I'm going to say right now what I say always when I do drug talks around the gay LGBTQ population. This could be alcohol. This could be marijuana, if you believe marijuana is an illegal drug. This could be any drug, and there's a preponderance in the LGBTQ population towards substance use. And the question I think we need to ask ourselves is not so much why meth, but why drugs in general. And if I were doing a talk on theories right now, I would talk about minority stress theory and the role that psychosocial burdens and minority stressors play in the lives of LGBTQ people. But I think that's very much what's at play here. And when we think about populations that are marginalized because of their race or their economic condition or their immigrant status or their sexual orientation or their gender identity, we tend to see more problematic behavioral outcomes, including but not limited to drug use, but also higher levels of mental health issues and what have you. In this very complicated chart here from this paper that was published recently, this was a paper that looked at evaluated hospitalizations for meth use. And what I really want you to attend to is the first column in each box, looking at differences in terms of hospitalizations across age, race, ethnicity, primary form of paying, income, region of the country, and what have you. Now, let's go to just a couple of them because I think it's important to point these out. Go to race, ethnicity. Although this says amphetamine, this is truly actually an indication of methamphetamine. What you see here is that most of the hospitalizations between 2014 and 2015 in the United States, in terms of meth use or amphetamine use, but meth use, let's say, were 70% were among white people. So the white population is the population that is overrepresenting in terms of the use of meth. And then when we look at region of the country, on the right-hand side there, you will see that despite the fact that there are many, many, many labs, what appears to be like many, many more labs in the East Coast, the preponderance of hospitalizations are on the West Coast. And so this is a phenomenon, I think it is a leftover phenomenon, as the drug was primarily a drug that was on the West Coast and in Hawaii for a very long time, and then has only slowly made itself over across the United States in the last 20 years. Not surprising to me or to any of you is the fact that when we look at the hospitalizations, if you look at the box on the right again, meth is rarely used alone, right? And so it is often used in combinations with other drugs, including alcohol. Okay, so again, here is a chart that's based on this previous analysis, and you will see that consistently over time there has been an increase in amphetamine-related hospitalizations and amphetamine plus one more substance hospitalization. And you break it down, all hospitalizations, and then you look at amphetamines plus one other drug, which could be alcohol or cannabis or coke, amphetamine only, and then amphetamine plus opioids, and lo and behold, all are moving in the same direction, an increase. And the attention that meth has been getting recently has been directed primarily by this combination of crystal meth, which is artificial and is produced on the street, and also synthetic versions of opioids, which have led to a set of documented overdoses in the United States. And here also is a look at these hospitalizations again, as per that chart we looked at before. And you see that while the West is certainly much higher in terms of the hospitalizations, there's a general upward trend across all regions of the country in terms of meth use in the last 15 years. Okay, so what does meth use do to one's well-being? So I want to start by saying, first of all, that the drug affects the physical health of an individual, the mental health of an individual, the social health of an individual, and the sexual health of an individual. It is a multi-targeting drug that just doesn't have an effect on one aspect of a person's well-being. So what happens when somebody uses meth? So immediately after use, there's this rush that somebody feels, and it's an extremely pleasurable rush, and we'll talk about that for a second. And that rush and that high result from the release of a drug known as dopamine. So right here is a very simple illustration of a section of one's brain, a neuron with a space between the neurons called the synapse. And what you see there is this neurotransmitter called dopamine. Now, what happens when we are eating some delicious food, or kissing the person that we love, or enjoying a wonderful day in the sun, is that the brain releases dopamine into the synapse, and that makes us feel pleasure. That pleasure is related to food or sex or whatever other thing that gives individuals pleasure. And so the little black circles get released into the synapse, and they hang out there for a little bit, making you feel pleasurable, and then over time, the dopamine is reabsorbed into the synapse. And that's great. But what meth does is that when you use meth, not only it does two things. One, it releases intense amounts of dopamine into the synapse, like intense, like 200 times more pleasurable feeling than eating, let's say, I don't know, a piece of blueberry pie, if that's your pleasure. That's number one. But number two, what it then does, the drug blocks the reabsorption of the dopamine back into the synapse. So not only is there a huge rush that one feels, but that pleasurable feeling lasts for a long time because the dopamine resides in the synapse for a long period of time. And herein lies the physiological basis of the psychological addiction. Because when one is feeling really good for a very long time, despite what one looks like or despite what one's going on, it is hard to get people to be back in a place where they're feeling pleasure without the use of the drug. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Behaviorally, the drug leads to a heightened sex drive, as does many stimulants, to euphoria, to decreased appetite. So it is not uncommon to see individuals who are chronic meth users being extremely thin, decreased fatigue, but then over time, as one becomes more and more addicted, social isolation. Right? So while the drug may be used at the beginning as a means for socializing with others, in fact, over time, when one becomes addicted, one becomes also reclusive. From a physiological perspective, what one notices with meth users is increase in respiration, increases in body temperature. I'm going to come back to the third one in a second. That should say urinary retention, dry mouth, and penile dysfunction. Let me talk about the third one and the last one. The biggest challenge we have with the physiological effects of methamphetamine, besides the dopamine release and the behaviors that are associated with that and the psychological realities with that, is that meth, because it is a stimulant, puts huge pressure on the cardiovascular system. And it is not uncommon for individuals who are methamphetamine users to experience strokes, heart attacks, and other cardiovascular events. That's number one. Number two, final bullet, penile dysfunction. Methamphetamine is a drug that I said causes increased sexual drive. but it also creates penile dysfunction, as does any stimulant, erectile dysfunction. So in the gay population, and this is probably also true in the straight population, it is not uncommon for individuals who are meth users to also mix methamphetamine use with the use of Viagra and Cialis and other erectile dysfunction medications. Because then the individual not only has the sex drive, but has the ability to perform because of these PD5 inhibitors, these Cialis and Viagra that they're taking. The psychological effects are enormously problematic, and ongoing use of the drug can result in damage to the central nervous system. But moreover, behaviorally, ongoing use of methamphetamine leads to confusion, insomnia, aggressiveness, anxiety, psychotic features, including paranoia. And I'll tell you a story of one of our participants from one of our early studies who was a meth user who lived in an apartment in the Chelsea section of Manhattan in New York City. And when he was high on meth, this is a gay man in his 40s at the time, he said he would look out his window and he was completely convinced that outside his window, in between the buildings, there were men dressed in leather who were having sex with each other. And we probed him on this, and we recorded this interview, and we had this story. Now, lo and behold, we followed this individual for a long period of time in one of our studies. And as he started to become sober and stop using methamphetamine, what he realized when he looked out his window was that they, in fact, were not people out there having sex, but in fact, it was clothes and other fabrics that were placed on lines, as you know, like it often happens in cities. People do their clothing and they put them on a line with a clothespin to dry, and those are fluttering in the wind, and the image, those images in his brain translated to individuals having sex. So that is a classic example of the paranoia, well, the hallucination in that case, but then also paranoia, which tends to follow as a result of use. Continued use of the drug may cause irreparable damage to the endings of the nerve endings of the brain. So, you know, there's the psychological realities of meth use are hugely problematic. Although, in the moment, I will say this. I'm talking about all these negative outcomes of use of meth. Individuals who are using meth don't really think about this. This is not where they're headed. What they know they're feeling is pleasure. And what they know and how they think they look is not actually how they look, because they are having hallucinations, they are feeling really good, and they are feeling on top of the world. So what we might see, those of us who are not using meth, in working with this person is not necessarily what the person might see who's actually using meth. In addition to the psychological, behavioral, and physiological effects of meth use, there are also the social effects of meth use. And meth users, then individuals who become addicted to meth, have been documented to experience economic and social downturns. So individuals become highly addicted, lose their jobs, lose their social circles, lose their relationships, lose their housing, and what have you. I'm in the process right now of engaging with a healthcare provider of mine who has become addicted to meth, who has had a very flourishing business for a very long time as a healthcare provider, and now is just completely, it's all falling apart. So this particular individual, in addition to having to deal with the addiction that he is experiencing, is also going to, at the end of the day, unless his behavior changes, unless we treat his methamphetamine addiction, he's going to also lose all of the things he's worked through throughout his entire life. Those stories are not uncommon. In the early days of AIDS, when doctors were treating people and people were dying left and right, many of those doctors eventually became addicted to meth because of the high impact that the stress of dealing with HIV had in their lives. It's not an excuse for using meth, but it is a pattern that we have seen not uncommonly in providers who have been put into the trenches to deal with these really, really horrific situations around HIV and other disasters that have affected us. This image is one of the most powerful images I have used throughout my career in trying to talk about meth use. And what you see very clearly here is the same person who starts using meth at age 28 and what she looks like at age 37. And you see the wasting, You see, you see the complete physical deterioration of the individual over time. The person in this image was dead at age 38. But I assure you that if you ask this individual, who at age 37 looked the way that I think she would identify as she, I'm not sure, looked, they would say to you that they looked the way they did at age 28. And so this is, again, the hallucinations, the non-realistic, views of the world that emerge as a result of meth use. For gay men, this will come to this idea in a second. The kind of sex that individuals, gay men and others, have when they're high on meth is like no other sex in the world. And so it's very difficult once one stops using meth to return to a normalcy around sex, because everything seems amazing and fantastical when one is high on meth, whether it is or not. And I think, if we were to video record people, if this was ethical, which we're not saying we would do, but if you were to see, two documentaries that I might recommend to the group, Party Boy, which is available on YouTube, which is about meth use in the black population, and then Rock Bottom, which is another documentary, which is a bit older, about 10 years old, you will see behaviors that, for the users in the film seem really sexy and wonderful, but to the viewer outside watching it did not look so great. So, I think that psychological reality is something that we constantly have to deal with. So, the use of the drug in populations leads to greater sexual adventurism. I will say what I've also said for a very long time. Does meth use lead to more sexual adventurism, or is a desire for sexual adventurism what drives people to meth use? I think it is overly simplistic for us to say that somebody uses meth and all of a sudden they become sexually adventurous. I think, in fact, they do become sexually adventurous, but I think it is a desire, at least our research has shown that it is a desire for a certain kind of sex, for a more extreme sex, a more frequent sex, more partners that may lead individuals to use drug. Disinhibition of the drug to the person's behavior results in the kind of fantastical sex that might want to have. It also, for HIV positive people, and we have a paper that shows this, may ameliorate the burden of being HIV positive. In one of our studies that we recently published, we actually showed that many individuals, about half in the sample, actually didn't use meth before they became positive, but after they became HIV positive as a way of coping with meth. And I come back to a point I made about 20 minutes ago, maybe 10 minutes ago, that if you're put upon because of who you are, if society is getting down on you because of your race and your sexual orientation, and now let's add to that your HIV status, use of a drug like meth makes the life a little bit, in the moment, seem a little bit easier. And that's the problem. In the absence of support, in the absence of effective systems to help an individual deal with those stressors one faces in one's life, the use of drugs to cope with those, while not necessarily appropriate or necessarily the best route, is understandable. And I hope we leave this conversation with a compassion that people just don't wake up one morning and decide they're going to be meth users, right? That's an understanding that people don't wake up one morning to decide they're going to have cardiovascular disease or they're going to be obese, but that life circumstances get them to this place. And unless we address those life circumstances, we're not going to get rid of the addiction. And it's just one of the points I'm going to make later on. I'm just going to highlight for you some findings from my very, 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 very first study. This is a vintage Perry Halkitis study now. It's 20 years old. One of the first studies I did around meth use called Project Tina. And I will say to you that the findings in this study that is now 20 years old, small pilot study, speak as much today to meth use in the gay population as it did 20 years ago. So let me just highlight some things for you. So this is a very small survey of about 50 men who were identified as meth users. Not surprising, the majority of the participants in the study indicated to us that their meth use was often limited to weekend use. And this is the pattern that we tend to see. A drug that is used primarily for good times on the weekends, for socialization, eventually becomes chronic use. And so the majority of the people in the study reported this as a weekend drug. Another paper of ours, actually, when we mapped out the days of use, we were able to show, I don't think I have it in the slide deck, we were able to show that use increased on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, started to go down on Sunday and Monday. The problem, of course, given what I've told you about the chemistry of methamphetamine, is that the people who stop using on Sunday are still high on Tuesday. So here's what Bob, this was a mixed method study, said about their meth use. I'm probably using it once every 2 weeks, something like that, generally on a weekend, either, I guess, under two circumstances. One is whether I'm at the baths, or if somebody comes to my apartment and we do it there. So here is a 32-year-old HIV-negative man telling us that it is his weekend use, it is his pleasurable use, and it is associated with sex. And to the point of sex, the majority of the people in the study at that point indicated to us that their use was always tied with sex, some 60%. To that point, John, 54 years old, said, I find that my experience of sex is very context specific. Taking it at the baths is very different from taking it in my apartment with one other person. I think my sexual experience has changed somewhat to profoundly over the time. I find the sexual experiences on crystal meth quite different from sexual experiences without crystal. That is a key sentence there. I find them more interesting and engaging. So, clinicians, this is what you have to grapple with if you're trying to get a person who is using crystal with sex to stop using, because the sex appears to be more interesting and engaging. And this is the challenge we've had in our intervention work with gay men, is that they often relapse because they want to have that kind of sex again. Not surprising, as I showed earlier, meth use is rarely used alone. In this particular sample, we saw that it was used with a variety of different substances, including ketamine, marijuana, ecstasy, and lo and behold, there's Viagra, some 88% reporting it, using it with Viagra. And Paul, who was 22 and we interviewed, said, I mixed and matched with other drugs, definitely marijuana, alcohol, cocaine sometimes, it just depends. It depends on what's available at the time and where I am. And so throw into this now synthetic opioids like fentanyl, and you get the problem to the cardiovascular and to the neurological system and to the other systems of the body that cause the body to shut down and to eventually to die. When we asked individuals where they use meth, what is interesting is that this drug, meth, like coke, was referred to as a club drug for a very long time because it was often used in clubs. So we know perfectly well that while people did use these drugs in clubs, the fact is that most of the time they were using them at home. And so in this particular study, that is exactly what we found. Almost everyone in the study talked about using meth at either a lover's or a friend's home. Of course, they use it at bars. Of course, they use it at bathhouses. Sometimes at home alone, probably preparing to go to a bar or a bathhouse or a lover's house, but almost always it was sex at home with a friend or a lover. Here's the chart. I do have it here. Lo and behold, lovely. And you will see here, this is actually brand new chart. This is a brand new chart from the P18 cohort study, which is a study we just finished about a year ago. This was a cohort of 18 to 25-year-olds that we followed from 18 to 25, and this was use of meth among a subsample, a very small number of them, which I'll talk about later. And this analysis undertaken by one of our data analysts, by Rich Martino, I'm going to give a shout out to, shows exactly the same pattern of days of use as we'd seen in a paper published over a decade ago, which is some use Monday, going down Tuesday, going down Wednesday, and then lo and behold, that uptick Thursday, Friday, and Saturday with a downtick Sunday. And so this curve, again, very indicative of the weekend use that turns into chronic use and which affects a person all week long because of the chemistry of the drug. We also, in that particular study, that study had two cohorts, one that began at 18, one that began at 22. Some in the first cohort took part in the second cohort. What I want to talk about here is the age at which they first started using the drugs. And this gets to, although it doesn't really show, the point that I'm going to make throughout this presentation is that for gay men, certainly, this may not be true for heterosexual youth, meth is not often the drug they go to first, but it's the drug they come to later. And it tends to skew older, both in terms of onset of use and chronic use. But you see, while we only had two people, this is unique individuals, two unique individuals reporting use at 18. We had like 9 and 10 when they were older, in their 20s. When we asked meth users, and I'm flipping back to Project Tina, asked meth users who, if their friends use meth, not surprising, half or most or a few of their friends were meth users. Those with friends who use meth were also likely to use meth more frequently. And so the socialization around meth is something that is also apparent. And so Daryl, who's 28 years old and HIV positive, said, I've done it with some friends. Every time I've done it, and when we've done it at the different atmospheres, the first time was at their home at a party. The other time, a couple of times, we were at the home at a sex clubs, commercial establishments, including the last time. So meth users tend to be meth users. And I will say that what happened was really interesting sort of historical phenomenon is that when people started to pay attention to meth in the early 2000s in New York City and in the Northeast and in Miami and in Washington, this drug, which was, you know, very much perceived to be a drug used by A-list gay men, became a drug that was frowned upon. And so a lot of the behavior became underground, and not surprising, meth users befriended other meth users. I will say that we are now fast forwarding 15 years or so into a new generation of gay men who didn't see those messages around meth use. So I think one of my explanations for the uptick in meth use in gay men recently is because we have a new generation coming of age that was not exposed to those negative messages that others had been before. I could show you slide upon slide upon slide about sexual behavior with meth. And in this one, but I will just show you one. And this is the orange bar showing condomless as compared to the blue bar condom sex. And pretty consistently, regardless of the partnerings, at the bottom you see the different partners, an HIV negative person with an HIV negative partner, an HIV negative person with an HIV positive partner, an HIV negative person with an HIV unknown status partner. Pretty consistently, when Tina or meth is in the mix, there's much more condomless sex than there is when somebody is not using meth. And so Andrew, who's 31 years old, said, I've been in New York 2 years next month, and my crystal use since I moved to New York sort of has crossed over primarily into the sexual arena. I would say that I probably use it 2 to 3 times a month. Here's that weekend thing again. And now sexual situations. To be very candid with you, in the past year, I sort of found myself drawn to the crystal crowd. Here's the socialization piece. And a lot of times it's kind of like a domino effect. I meet more and more people from this crowd, and it's a group that tends to be, there's a lot of sex parties. And there's the sexual part of it. So that is a conglomeration of lots of the ideas we talked about so far. Also, I noted earlier the idea that more extreme sex, more adventurous sex, whatever it is the term, I'm not judging it, I'm just saying different kinds of sex than the traditional sexual behavior is evident when individuals are using meth. And you see here, generally, on the left side, meth use, on the right side, sober, all different behaviors, including fisting and the S&M and group sexual behaviors, much higher when somebody is high on meth and when they're not high on meth. And I ask the question again, is it the meth that causes the behavior, or is it the desire for that kind of behavior that results in the meth use, which then allows the behavior to occur? So let's turn our attention to the idea of meth and opioids. So for the last 5 years or so, we've been obsessed with opioids. I actually will talk about an editorial I wrote a little while ago talking about why that is so short-sighted, but let's start with, and here it is, in fact. If you're interested in this editorial, you can, buzz that QR reader with your phone. So I wrote this in 2018. It appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And it was really my call out to the United States that I'd heard enough about opioids. And my concern was that the attention to opioids was detracting from drug addiction generally, but also from this particular drug, meth, that I was extremely concerned about. So here's what I wrote. Despite very clear statistics pointing to the challenge created by meth addiction, the drug is not in the national dialogue in the manner that heroin and other opioids are. And the reason for that is simple. The infiltration of opioid addiction into suburban, white, middle-class America, the mainstream America, creates a panic in these communities of privilege and power. Meth, on the other hand, lodges itself in more marginalized populations, including the rural poor and urban minority communities. Meth's chokehold on those communities proliferates cycles of disenfranchisement, poverty, and health issues on an already burdened population. Research, much of it my own, has documented the impacts of meth on the gay population, certainly of little interest to many Americans who hope to pray gay away. Most recently, our own studies have shown the proliferation of meth into the Black gay population, often poor and often living with HIV. If America doesn't care about gay men, I assure you, its racism and adoration of wealth make little time for poor Black HIV-positive gay men. And I we believe those words, and I own those words truly and totally, and believe that why meth has not gotten the attention that it has is because it has not affected suburban white kids. When it starts affecting suburban white kids, you're going to see presidents like the one in the White House now start paying attention. So while and then I was very happy to see that like a week or two later, CNN did a story, which was great. I feel responsible for that story. While America wages war on opioids, meth makes its comeback to this story from September 26, 2018. And this is just some more data that I think point to the issue I was raising in the editorial. So here are some data on federal prosecutions by drugs. You see in pink marijuana because of the legislation changing throughout the country, thank God. But then you see methamphetamine and heroin both moving up, but methamphetamine prosecutions much higher than than heroin prosecutions. Here is meth seizures in the United States, and again, this is from CNN, border protection like seizures across the border increasing tenfold between 2010 and 2018. National drug seizures of meth use, again, outpacing heroin. Look at that. Methamphetamine in that sort of teal color, that aqua color, heroin in that grayish color. And again, both increasing, but methamphetamine at much higher rates. And then here is a picture of methamphetamine overdoses in the state of Oklahoma. And here you see an upswing with a little downtick in the last year or so, but generally the pattern just going up. So in fact, in 2014, when the last, I think it was 2014 or 2015, when the behavioral surveillance of HIV was undertaken around gay men, often referred to by the CDC as men who have sex with men, a term I don't particularly like, but in gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men, there was also a slight uptick in methamphetamine use. So we will see. It's a cross-sectional study, so it's hard to talk about patterns. We'll see in the next cycle, which is coming up, what the data look like there, if there continues to be a movement in that direction, which I think there probably will be. So, between 2010 and 2016, federal prosecutions of heroin increased some 300%. At the same time, federal prosecutions of methamphetamine also increased, not as steeply, but in greater numbers, from 5,000 cases to 7,000 cases. There have been large increases in fentanyl analog and heroin deaths between 2013 and 2017, but there have also been meth-related deaths, tripling to 10,700 in 2017, tripling from 3,600 in 2013. So meth is on the rise. Meth users in marginalized populations. Meth affects all aspects of a person's well-being, and we're not paying attention. So what is also problematic, and what I'm going to conclude with today, are some thoughts about methamphetamine treatment. And I'm going to start this conversation by saying there's no gold standard treatment for meth use. I'm going to provide you with some ideas of things that have been tried. And then I'm going to end with some thoughts about harm reduction, because I think in the absence of effective treatment, recognizing signs and symptoms and using harm reduction approaches is probably one of the best tools we have in our arsenal. So there are 3 sets of behavioral interventions that have taken place. Probably the most effective, contingency management, which individuals are rewarded for every time they present without any meth in their urine or their hair or what have you. And there have been a set of studies, mostly on the West Coast, that have proven this. A lot of these are on the West Coast. Cognitive behavioral therapy has also shown to reduce meth use among gay and bisexual men, and behavioral activation, an approach that has been used by our colleague Matthew Mimiaga, has also led to changes in the behavior. But the problem I have with all of these approaches is that they're based on this idea that human beings are rational decision makers, and we know that human beings are not rational decision makers, and these models are based on that very, very shaky assumption. It's very much like efforts around HIV in the 1980s and 1990s that just assumed the message wear a condom every time would work. because if somebody had a lot of self-efficacy or a lot of confidence that they would use a condom, then they would use a condom. What was forgotten in that process is that often people have emotions, and often people use substances, and cognitive decision-making is altered as a result of that. And so while I will support the idea that these models certainly in a statistical analysis show an effect, I wonder in real life how truly effective they are. There are also possibilities, and I'm not poo-pooing them, that's one option. It's just, I don't know if it's the be-all and end-all. There are also pharmacotherapies, and there is some evidence that some medications may work. In fact, the use of antidepressants has been one particularly helpful method for helping people who come off methamphetamine. If we believe that methamphetamine addiction is as much a biological as it is a behavior, or as a psychological as it is a social phenomenon, then certainly let's pay attention to the biology. And the biology tells us that perhaps there is a faulty neurotransmitter functioning in a person's brain, leading them to be depressed or have other psychopathology. And if we regulate that, there might not be a need for methamphetamine as a way of dealing with that faulty neurotransmitter behavior. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that there are biological bases of addictions, right? And people are often drawn to drugs that deal with those biological bases. And for methamphetamine users, it may be depression, and it may be faulty dopamine production in their brain. And so as a result, use of methamphetamine to compensate for faulty dopamine production may be one of the reasons people become addicted. So I'm going to leave just you with final thoughts about meth use in terms of harm reduction. There are many behaviors that happen as a result of meth use, including one set of behaviors, diminished food intake, eating only junk food, not sleeping. I want to talk about this first set of behaviors. First of all, why do people who are chronic meth users have teeth that look horrific, which I often think we should use as a way of preventing people from using meth? Because when people are using meth, several things happen. They have limited salivary production, which causes dryness of the mouth. They grind their teeth, because that is one of the behaviors that is manifest when people are using meth. They do not engage in good oral hygiene because they're high, and they're not eating. And after they come off the high, they consume large amounts of sweets to compensate for the not eating. And that leads to this condition of the teeth that we end up seeing. So there are several things one can do to address the diminished food intake, the eating only junk food, and the not sleeping, including the forgetting to drink, the eating sugary foods, and the grinding of teeth. So providing water and healthy food where possible, encouraging meth users to sleep whenever possible in a dark room and eat healthy, hydrating people, distributing toothbrushes and toothpaste these are small steps that we can take to try to diminish some of the ravages created by the use of the drug. Individuals who are binging have increased risk for psychosis, paranoia, anxiety, and and other health problems. We need to create safe spaces for individuals to use the drug, to develop methods for helping them keep track of how much the drug they're using, to have a harm reduction buddy, perhaps, right? And introducing plans that will keep them safe. Just like we have drunk drivers for individuals who are out drinking, and then one person's a designated driver, maybe there needs to be a designated non-meth user at that, making care of all those people. Heavy users experience withdrawal and crashes. Some have suicidal ideation, moodiness. Engaging with individuals, for psychological support, making sure they're talking to individuals and getting psychological support is going to be an extremely important element for getting people to manage their psychoses and what have you around their meth use. And then in terms of injection behavior, that we have the possibility of blood-borne diseases being passed, lung damage, toxicity, cuts and burns. One of the most effective systems we've had in place for maintaining the HIV epidemic in injection drug users is a distribution of clean needles and syringes and ensuring that the people use clean works. The same model would be appropriate here. In terms of also injection use, a harm reduction approach would be to have individuals move to transitioning away from injecting and smoking to using the drugs in less harmful ways. And what happened? This is the same slide here. So we also have to, one of the other phenomena that happens when individuals are using meth is they have a paranoia where they think that they have bugs in their skin. When they scratch their skin, and you often see open wounds from what are referred to as speed bugs. These are not really bugs, but they're perceived bugs. You know, we need to get people into a calm, centered place when they're experiencing that, to ensure them that there aren't these bugs there, because the paranoia is really what's happening there. And so engaging with people, having a buddy in place is going to be really critical there. And then, of course, for sexual behavior, the ongoing need to emphasize the importance of sexual transmission of pathogens, providing free access to condoms and lubes, you know, making sure that HIV negative folks are on PrEP and the HIV positive folks are on medication. If we want to really use our biomedical technologies in an effective way, then making sure that those who are most high risk, those who are engaging in sex risk, in condomless sex, are either, if they're negative on PrEP or if they're HIV positive, taking their medication is going to be really, really, really key. And having people create tools and keep them on their medications on a consistent basis. It's not going to solve the fact that there is gonorrhea and chlamydia and other STIs which are on the rise out there, but in terms of HIV, it's going to be a really critical step. And, you know, one of the things I've thought about for a while is maybe one of the things we want to do is think about providing on-demand PrEP for people who go and party on weekends, whether they go to Asbury Park or they go to Fire Island or they go to Miami or the other places that gay men and others socialize. Maybe on-demand PrEP is something that we should make available to them, because now there's some evidence that we know, for those at least who are HIV negative, that taking PrEP intermittently might also have a beneficial effect. So I'm just going to leave it here and leave you with some contact points. You can follow us on Twitter, on all of those sites, on Instagram, and our website. And as Colleen mentioned earlier, this book is available that provides, you know, a really holistic approach to understanding the use of methamphetamine addiction. Thank you for being so attentive, and thank you for so many of you being on this webinar. I think we have now some time for questions, comments, and other assorted ideas.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Halkitis. That was incredible, actually, and I learned a lot, a tremendous amount. There are lots of questions, so I will just go ahead and get started, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm ready. And I will try my best to answer these questions.
Great, thank you. Is there data to suggest that the negative messages of the early 2000s contributed to gay men abstaining from use? Was there a prevention benefit to that?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's evidence from the early 2000s that there was a set of posters that came out early on that were very seductive, and there's evidence that of very beautiful individuals and with signs saying crystal meth, free of crystal, and that those actually acted as triggers to meth use. There is anecdotal evidence, although not substantial amounts of evidence, that it decreased meth use. It may have decreased onset of meth use for some people, but the data are shaky at best. However, I will say that in the absence of messaging, of which there is none right now, any messaging is going to have an effect that will be at least prevent onset of use, even if it's a slight decrease in onset of use. So my short answer to this: no, not really clear evidence, but I do believe that I do believe anecdotally it did have a beneficial effect, and something that we should be thinking about again.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that the shift from bathhouses and bars to the contemporary online hookup culture, has that contributed in any way to use patterns? I
think it's easy. Well, that's a really great question, and one that I want to find out about. So look, I think it is easier to communicate in an online platform than it is in person. For those of us who are older, or as I like to refer to as vintage, We will remember that to meet partners in the past, one had to go out and get rest and stuff. And socializing face to face may be in some ways more challenging than facing online. So I wonder if communication around drug use is also facilitated by online platforms. I will tell you that our own experience at my research center shows that there is very open communication about meth use on online platforms, and in fact, it may be increasing the use of meth if you believe that online platforms increase access to a larger number of people. Then the probability theory would argue that if you have access to a larger number of people, then you also have a higher likelihood of proliferating the drug as compared to a small group of people in a confined physical space. So my long-term answer to that is yes, probably it has.
Okay, great, thank you. Are you aware of any treatment facilities in New Jersey that have programs specifically for LGBTQ population who use substances?
But I think that in New Jersey and in New York City, no, I am not familiar with any particular one, but I will tell you what many LGBTQ people turn to as a means, and I did not address this in my slides, but turn to as a means for dealing with their addiction: Crystal Meth Anonymous. Crystal Meth Anonymous, like Alcoholics Anonymous, seems to be the go-to default approach for many meth users. I trust there are CMA groups here in New Jersey. I know they take place in New York City. That is where I would start if I was looking to find other facilities that were specifically targeted to meth. But I think we may see an increase in meth-related services throughout the state now that people are starting to have this conversation again.
Okay, great, thank you. This is a question from Seattle, and this person is saying that in Seattle, there's been some talk on using Ritalin as a treatment for meth addiction and cravings.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I say yes, because we know that people with ADHD we've written about this, have a higher likelihood of using meth than people without ADHD. And I think that like I said earlier, that undiagnosed depression is often a driver of meth use. I think undiagnosed ADHD is also. And if Ritalin, if prescribed and as a harm reduction technique and as one that is able to compensate and create a sort of like a diminishing demand for meth use, is probably a really, really good approach for those individuals who I would say are experiencing ADHD as one of the reasons that they're using their meth use. But I have heard this and I believe it to be completely true. In fact, as we know, meth was used to treat ADHD in the 1950s. So why not use Ritalin now as a way of sort of addressing this particular problem? Better Ritalin, which is prescribed, than meth, which is made out on the street.
Right. This question might be similar to that. Someone referred to a place in Texas that was using a combination of Wellbutrin and Provigil, and this person did some of their own personal research and found that Provigil might be beneficial. Are you familiar with that, or do you have thoughts on that?
I don't have familiarity with that drug. I know Wellbutrin has definitely had a positive, had definitely been used effectively for the use of meth. I know also Wellbutrin and other antidepressants from a very seminal study that took place in Australia in the early 2000s was used as a way of sort of modulating and moderating and I don't want to say diminishing because that's a strong word, sexual adventurism, and sexual risk-taking. So when people had undiagnosed depression, undiagnosed and untreated depression, even if it was mild to moderate, there tended to be more sexual risk-taking. And when individuals were placed in a condition where they were on antidepressants, they continued to have sex. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't have sex, but at least their sex was more, thoughtful in its approach than when they were not being treated.
Okay, great, thank you. I think this one you may have referenced a bit. Do you think that the lack of mental health services contributes or is a factor in meth use as a way of coping? And if so, is there something mental health providers, is there a way they should be tailoring their treatment approach for people who are dealing with a meth addiction?
I believe that all addictions have an underlying mental health driver. I don't believe that people become addicted because they have no other reason to be, as I said before. So look, I would say the following. I would say if you are a therapist or a counselor or a social worker who's working with a person who's a meth addicted, you need to address what the meth brings to that person's life. And often for some, it's about feelings of self-worth and feelings of sexuality. And so treatment must not just focus on the use of the drug, right? But what the drug gives the person, particularly the sexual pleasure that it gives the person. And I think where a lot of treatment goes wrong and where a lot of counseling goes wrong is that it ignores the beneficial effect or the perceived beneficial effect that the drug provides to a person's sexual life. And unless you address that, you're not going to get the addiction. So I think that's counselors and clinicians and doctors who, MDs need to be having open, honest conversations with their patients about, their sex lives in order to be able to really address. If you're going to talk about meth, you've got to talk about sex.
And that actually leads to this next question. So with the lack of LGBT health competence in most healthcare settings, what can be done to address the sexualized use without further alienating or entrenching homophobia from healthcare providers?
I think that going and doing LGBTQ health, I've been going throughout the state of New Jersey and doing LGBTQ healthcare trainings to some extent. I've been on it in New York also. I think that we have to continue. I think, the homophobia is going to always exist, right? Rush Limbaughs are always going to make comments about Pete Buttigieg of the world, right? That's the way it is right now. But we as providers and we as advocates for the LGBTQ population can't let that deter us from actually going out and doing these trainings and having conversations and being loud about it. And so what was the question? I don't know if I answered it, but I think I'm going to answer if you ask it again. Should we do more trainings? Is that what it is?
Yes.
Yeah, yes. So the answer is yes, we have to, because we know that 1 in 5 LGBTQ people avoid healthcare because they fear discrimination, right? So I think there are more good docs out there than bad docs. There are more good nurses than bad nurses. And if we can continue to provide them the skills, 1, and 2, then provide patients with resources of where to go, we're going to help nip this in the bud. And I think most of you are aware that the Human Rights Campaign every year now publishes a report on LGBTQ competent providers throughout the country. I think we should be pointing our patients to that report. And there are excellent facilities in New Jersey that have received very high scores in terms of LGBTQ competency. There's no reason for people to be running off to New York City and Philadelphia. There are great services here in the state also. But there's still work to be done, right? There's enormous work to be done, from very simple things like changing intake forms to make sure that they include sexual orientation and gender identity, to having more complex conversations about sex with the healthcare provider and the patient. So I think there's a ton of work to be done. And I actually think public health has a place to do this work too. And I would like to, at our school, one of the things that I'm hoping to do over the course of the next year is, a series of trainings for public health entities throughout the state of New Jersey, because I think public health entities need to hear it too. And it's not just enough to work with the clinic and the doctor, but you have to deal with the population perspective also. Long answer.
No, that's okay. That was great. Thank you. How do you recommend increasing the recognition or awareness of meth use as a legitimate concern beyond just the rural stigma to bring it to the same level as the opioid crisis?
I think doing things like what we're doing today, and making sure that we're all at the table. And like when people bring up opioids, I did this, I don't know where I was recently, maybe 6 months ago, where somebody raised, and where's the opioid problem? And meth. Right? I think every opportunity we have to be able to go out there and write these stories or be at a table and define it is going to be critical. And I'm going to do a shout out to my colleagues in New Jersey. My colleagues at various community-based organizations, including the folks at the visiting nurses in Asbury Park, who were really adamant that the state pay attention to the meth problem in gay men that they were seeing in Asbury Park. And as a result of that, they've really forced our hand. Not my hand, force the hand of of the state to actually not allow us to do work. And then we were happy to get on board at Rutgers at the School of Public Health to do work to truly figure out what's going on with meth use. But you all of you who are out there and on the ground working with patients, you see it. you need to be writing about it, you need to be talking about it, and you need to be pushing legislatures to be thinking about it. I assure you, I will do my part from where I sit to make sure that they hear about it also. And then, I brought it to the attention of, people within the governor's office. And I think there is an increasing awareness, certainly in our state, that this is something that we have to attend to, and that it just can't be this like one focus only opioids or fentanyl, because, it's that today, it's going to be something else tomorrow. And we've got to deal with the whole drug addiction landscape holistically. Yeah.
Thank you. If you're okay to take a few more, there are.
Oh, yeah. Keep going. Shoot them. Keep shooting them at me.
The question is, I understand that there's evidence to suggest that assessment, early identification, and referral is the ideal intervention. Are there any examples of this that you're aware of within publicly funded sexual health clinics?
I think places like GMHC do a really good job with this, where they actually, when they see people coming in, they actually do a whole, drug use battery. I think I would like this to be like norm in clinical care too, but I think GMHC does really good work in that regard. I think APLA does really good work in that regard, where they do intakes of patients and they try to find out what kind of drugs they're using from the moment they become clients at those agencies. So that is the ideal, but I think that those kinds of instruments also need to exist in emergency rooms and in clinical care, in clinics, and in doctors' offices also, if we're really to figure this out, how to deal with it. I will tell you, the people who are mostly seeing it and the people who are mostly reporting it are the counselors and the psychologists and the social workers, because there is this disconnect that happens between a patient and a medical provider, a physical medical provider, that seems to not be as apparent when we're dealing with mental health issues. So I think we have work to do to train our medical providers, our physical medical providers, with the skills to be able to ask the questions and provide the tools that actually ascertain that information from their clients, right? Instead of just sort of nodding their head and saying, you don't do drugs, right? Right? You know what the right answer is to that. You've got to make it safe for people to be able to talk about that. And that actually requires time. And I don't know if right now, the way our system is set up, that it allows for that. But I'm going to just say this. I mean, I'm also a very, very, very strong proponent that we have to be open and honest and out about this, right? Which is something I didn't say in the talk, which I'm going to say now, which is absolutely there is a responsibility, of the population at large and of governmental and other entities to address this. But there's also a responsibility that exists within populations and communities. And I'm going to speak to the LGBTQ population in particular. As long as we continue to make drug use okay, and as long as we, continue to proliferate the idea that one has to look a certain way and have sex a certain way, drug use is going to continue. And so there's a responsibility that has to happen from within also to change the way that people's lives are affected. Because when drug use is modeled and it is not questioned, and when a certain way of appearing and looking is created as the standard for people in the LGBTQ population, which I think it is, and those of us who are members of the population have experienced, then turning to drugs as a way of coping with that and turning to drugs as a way of being part of a social group is what happens. And so there's this inward reflection that we also need to do as a population that will lead to a change. It's not enough to just say it happens all from external places.
Right. Thank you. This question is asking if there's any evidence specific to seeing anxiety as a potential contributor or predictor of addiction. And is there any?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes. Anxiety and depression are the same thing. Right. So depression is, obsession with, preponderance with and concern about the past, and anxiety is the future. But basically, if you were to see a circle, draw a circle, and you go around the circle and, to where your fingers meet. If you draw with your two fingers, anxiety and depression are right next to each other. It's just like obsession past, obsession future. So as depression often people who have anxiety disorder are treated with antidepressants because it is the same neurotransmitters that also are affected. And so as a result, yes, anxiety is also a driver, just like depression is.
Great, thank you. I'll narrow it down. There are lots of comments. There's some appreciation of your past writings, Dr. Halkitis. I just want to reference those.
Thank you.
The H Generation, Stories of Survival and Resilience. Someone has cited your work in their dissertation, so just sharing that with you.
Thank you.
Yes, yes. Sorry, this one asks about the risk of a reference to meth use combined with other drugs and other substances. And the specific question is there a risk of combining meth with the use of poppers? And maybe you can explain exactly what poppers are.
Yeah, inhalant nitrates or isobutylnitrates. So poppers are substances that are often, I mean, everybody uses them, but they're commonly used by gay men to have sex with each other. And what's really interesting about poppers is that early in the AIDS epidemic, I remember reading a New York Times story that said that inhalant nitrates or poppers, I'll talk about what they are in a second, was one of the factors that led people to become HIV positive. And in fact, it was not that they were using poppers, that's because they were having sex. While they were having sex, they were using poppers. So poppers creates a rush feeling in a much more diminished level than meth does. Dilating capillaries, and as a result of that, it's easier to be penetrated, and you get this really pleasurable feeling, and it's easier for things to be inserted anally. So it is something that somebody sniffs, usually out of a bottle. It's like a liquid in liquid format, and sniffs it, and they get this rush that lasts for a short period of time. Yes, there is dangers to that, because that same drug, meth and that drug, are both putting any drug you add to the mix. Let's add cigarettes to the mix too, right? Anytime you add like another drug into the mix that is a stimulant, you're putting stress on the cardiovascular system. So absolutely, meth is going to stress the cardiovascular system. Meth and poppers are really going to stress the cardiovascular system. Meth and poppers and cigarettes are going to really, really stress the cardiovascular system. And quite frankly, maybe if you're 20 and your body's flexible and good and still pretty in shape, it may not have such damaging effects in the moment, but certainly as people age, those effects are going to be even more pronounced. So yeah, not a great combination.
Okay, thank you. This question is actually the first one addressing this. You've spoken a lot about how meth use manifests in gay sexual behavior, specifically amongst men. Can you speak about how it manifests in lesbian women, and if that's any different?
Yeah, there's not a lot of documented literature in lesbian women around meth use. Not that there isn't meth use probably in the lesbian population. I haven't studied it. I think there are other drugs that are used, including alcohol, at very high rates in lesbian women. But if lesbian women were to use meth, it would have the same sexual effects as it does for men. Certainly in heterosexuals, it has the same effects. It is a hypersexualizing drug, regardless of your sexual orientation. But the literature on lesbians is near absent on meth use. Okay,
thank you. I will end it with one last question, and I'll apologize to those that we did not get to. This question is asking if you can speak to what you know about racial differences with regards to meth use or research that's been done on that. I'm not certain if that means rates of meth use or if there's some other.
All of it. It means all of it. I have an answer. I have a complicated answer. In 2003, and I always tell this story, I love this story. In 2003, I went to a conference on the Big Island of Hawaii. It was actually the first time I went to the Big Island of Hawaii, which is amazing. It's like the wild horses I'm a boy from Queens, so big horses on the beach are always fascinating to me, right? We didn't have that in Queens. So I went to this conference, and it was all of us who were doing meth use research at the time. And I remember sitting there and talking about meth use and about meth use proliferating in the gay population, and a colleague saying to me, the black population is not going to use meth because they have a different allele structure and they metabolize meth differently. And I was like, well, I don't even know what you're talking about. But what I said in response to that was, I think that meth use in the black population is going to proliferate and it's going to grow. And if you believe that drug addiction is driven in part by social circumstances, then gay men are put upon, and I said this before, black gay men are particularly put upon. I mean, you see this in the South. You see it in HIV. You see it in every health condition that gay men face. Black gay men have it worse, right? Because they're not only gay, but they're also black, right? So you're getting it because of their race and their sexual orientation from this crappy society that we live in. So There are different. So in the early days of when we first started attending to this drug in like the late 1990s, early 2000s, the guys we were getting in our study, and I think most people would say this is true, were like white middle class guys. It has drastically shifted. Over the course of the last 20 years of me doing this work, the participants have become more Black, more old, more HIV positive. So there is definitely meth use in the Black population. I encourage you all to see this amazing documentary that my friend made called Party Boy. I just sponsored him. They're doing a screening in LA, I think it was last week. It's PARTY space BOI. It is an amazing representation of meth use in the Black population, in the Black gay population. And so I encourage you to watch it. So it's there, it's present. Black gay men are using meth. Yes, it is probably grown much more in the Black gay population than in the white gay population over the course of the last 2 decades.
Okay, thank you. Before we close for the program, I just want to mention, Dr. Halkitis, that the QR code actually was no longer active for some reason. I tried it, so that's okay. I will get that link. And for those who are on the call, I'll send that link out, as well as the references to the 2 videos that you've just referred to, Party Boy and Rock Bottom. I'll try to get the links for those and share that with those who are on the call. I think that will need to be the end of the questions. I have lots of thank yous here, a number of notes of appreciation, and asking that maybe you should do a TED Talk on this. I suspect you might have, or use. I know there's.
I haven't, but Colleen, can you arrange that?
I'm on that. I absolutely can be on that.
I would love to do that.
Lots of thank yous, and Dr. Halkitis, that was great, and I learned a tremendous amount. And I know the 295, 300 people who were on the webinar also learned a tremendous amount. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and I appreciate all of you being on this webinar. I think that, your presence on this webinar is an indication that there is clearly, like, we're all worried about something that's happening, and, collectively, if our voices are loud and unified, we can solve it. So thank you also for being on.
Thank you. And folks, please be sure to complete the evaluation that will be getting sent out in about 10 minutes or so. Please complete that this week so that we can take care of all your continuing ed credits and so on. And thank you all, and have a great afternoon. Thank you all so much for your time. Take care.